He won't remember anyway, my brother Derek laughed, sliding Dad's checkbook back into his jacket pocket. What's he gonna do, call the cops on his own son? We were standing in the hallway outside Dad's room at Sunset Manor Assisted Living on a Tuesday afternoon in March. Dad had just dozed off after lunch, his medication making him drowsy as always. My name is Michael Rodriguez. I'm 47 years old, and I work as a forensic accountant for the state of Arizona in Phoenix. In that moment, watching my brother casually joke about stealing from our father, who couldn't even remember what he'd eaten for breakfast, I knew everything was about to change. I just nodded and said nothing. Didn't argue, didn't threaten, didn't even ask what he meant. I simply watched as Derek adjusted his tie, the expensive silk one he couldn't afford on a construction supervisor's salary, and headed toward the elevator. "See you next week, Mike," he called over his shoulder. I waited until the elevator doors closed, then walked back into Dad's room and sat down beside his bed. Robert Rodriguez, 73 years old, former electrical engineer for Boeing, diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease 18 months ago. The man who taught me how to balance a checkbook, who'd made me promise to always look out for my little brother, was now staring at the ceiling with empty eyes. He didn't recognize me most days anymore, but sometimes, just sometimes, there were flashes of the sharp, methodical man who'd raised us after Mom died. "Hey, Dad," I whispered. "It's Michael, your oldest." He turned his head slightly. For just a moment his eyes seemed to focus. "Michael? You work with numbers, don't you?" "Yes, Dad. I work with numbers." He squeezed my hand weakly. "Something's wrong with the numbers, son. Someone's been taking things." That's when I knew Derek's stealing wasn't new. It was just getting bolder. Dad and Derek had never gotten along, not even before the diagnosis. Derek was the younger brother by 4 years, the one who'd dropped out of college, who'd had 3 different wives and twice as many jobs. Dad had bailed him out financially more times than I could count, always with lectures about responsibility that Derek ignored. When Dad started showing signs of cognitive decline, I'd assumed Derek would step up, help carry the load. Instead, I'd been handling everything alone. Doctor appointments, care facility arrangements, financial planning. Derek would show up occasionally, usually when he needed something. 6 months ago, when Dad's condition worsened and we moved him to Sunset Manor, I'd suggested we should both have power of attorney. Derek had agreed readily, too readily, I now realized. At the time, I thought he was finally being responsible. What I didn't know was that he'd been planning this for months. I drove straight from the nursing home to Pinnacle Bank, where Dad had maintained accounts for 37 years. Sandra Walsh, the branch manager, knew our family well. She'd processed the power of attorney paperwork herself. "Michael," she said, standing as I approached her desk. "How's your father doing?" "Not well," I replied, taking a seat. "Sandra, I need to review his account activity. There might be some irregularities." Her expression shifted slightly. "What kind of irregularities?" "Large withdrawals, possibly unauthorized." She pulled up Dad's accounts on her computer, then turned the monitor so I could see. My stomach dropped. In the past 6 months, there had been 17 separate withdrawals totaling $83,400. All but 2 were for amounts just under $5,000, clearly designed to avoid triggering automatic reporting requirements. "These withdrawals," I said, pointing at the screen. "Do you have documentation for them?" Sandra's face went pale. "Michael, I need to show you something." She pulled out a thick file folder labeled Rodriguez Robert, Transaction Records. Inside were photocopies of withdrawal slips, each bearing what appeared to be Dad's signature. But I'd been handling Dad's finances for months, helping him write checks when his handwriting became shaky. These signatures were too neat, too consistent. They looked like someone had been practicing. "Sandra, who processed these transactions?" "Different tellers," she said, flipping through the paperwork. "But they all required 2 forms of ID and the power of attorney documentation." "I need copies of everything," I said, "and I need to speak with your security department." 20 minutes later, I was sitting in a windowless room with Frank Morrison, Pinnacle Bank's security chief and a former FBI agent. He'd printed out the surveillance footage timestamps for each withdrawal. "Mr. Rodriguez," Frank said, his tone carefully neutral. "Before we proceed, I need to understand what you're alleging here." "I believe my brother has been forging my father's signature to steal money from his accounts. My father has advanced Alzheimer's disease and couldn't have authorized these transactions." Frank studied the paperwork, then looked at me directly. "Are you prepared to file a formal complaint?" "Yes, but first, I want to see the footage." For the next hour, I watched grainy security camera footage of my brother systematically robbing our father. 17 different visits. Always when I wasn't around. Always with the same confident demeanor. In one clip from 2 weeks ago, I could see him actually practicing Dad's signature on the back of a deposit slip before approaching the teller window. The final piece of evidence came when Frank enhanced the audio from the most recent visit. Derek's voice was clearly audible. My old man won't remember this anyway. Might as well put the money to good use before the nursing home takes it all. I sat back in my chair, feeling something cold settle in my chest. This wasn't desperation or a moment of weakness. This was calculated, systematic theft from a man who trusted him completely. What happens next? I asked Frank. I file a report with Phoenix PD and the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. The amount involved makes this a federal case. We'll need your formal statement and medical documentation of your father's condition. I nodded. Frank, how long has this been going on? I mean, could there be other accounts? His expression darkened. We'll find out. But Mr. Rodriguez? In my experience, people who do this once usually do it multiple times. That evening, I drove to Derek's house in Ahwatukee, a modest, ranch-style home that he'd been struggling to afford since his last divorce. His newest truck, a lifted Ford F-250 that cost more than most people made in a year, sat in the driveway. Through the window, I could see a massive new TV mounted on the wall. I didn't knock. Instead, I sat in my car and made a list of everything I needed to verify. Other bank accounts, credit card statements, any property transfers, and most importantly, the pattern of when these thefts had occurred. As a forensic accountant, I knew that financial crimes always left trails. Derek was smart enough to stay under reporting thresholds, but he wasn't smart enough to avoid creating patterns. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek. Heard you were asking questions at the bank. Everything okay with Dad's accounts? Word traveled fast in banking circles. I typed back, just being cautious. You know how it is. Yeah, totally understand. Want to grab coffee tomorrow? We should coordinate better. On Dad's care. I stared at the message for a long moment. Even now, even knowing I was on to him, Derek was still trying to manipulate the situation. Still playing the concerned son card. Sure, I replied. How about 10 a.m. at that Starbucks on Rural Road? Perfect. See you then, brother. I drove home to my apartment in Tempe, opened my laptop, and began building a timeline. In my line of work, I'd learned that successful prosecutions weren't built on emotion or outrage. They were built on documentation, patterns, and irrefutable evidence. Derek had given me plenty of all three. The next morning, I arrived at Starbucks 15 minutes early and positioned myself where I could see Derek's face clearly. He walked in at exactly 10 a.m., carrying himself with the same confident swagger I'd seen on the bank security footage. We ordered our drinks and sat down at a corner table. So, Derek said, stirring his coffee, what's got you worried about Dad's accounts? I watched his eyes carefully. Just routine checking, making sure all his expenses are properly documented for tax purposes. Derek nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. You always were the detail guy. He paused. Find anything unusual? A few irregularities, I said. Some large withdrawals that I can't account for. His hand stopped stirring, just for a second, but I caught it. Large withdrawals? Like what? Multiple transactions. Usually just under $5,000. 17 of them over the past 6 months. Derek's face remained neutral, but I saw his jaw tighten slightly. Huh. That is weird. Maybe the nursing home is billing him directly for some services? That's what I thought too, I said, pulling out a folder. But I called Sunset Manor this morning. They've never made direct withdrawals from his account. Everything goes through our automatic payments. I slid a copy of the withdrawal summary across the table. Derek glanced at it, and, for just a moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Fear, maybe. Or calculation. This is crazy, he said. But his voice had changed. Less confident. Who could be doing this? Well, I said carefully, it would have to be someone with power of attorney. Someone Dad trusts. Someone who could forge his signature convincingly. Derek looked up sharply. Mike, you're not suggesting— I'm not suggesting anything, I interrupted. I'm just stating facts. These withdrawals were made by someone with legitimate access to his accounts. Someone who knew his banking patterns and could practice his signature. We sat in silence for a moment. Derek's coffee sat untouched, and I could see him thinking, trying to figure out how much I knew. Look, he finally said. Maybe I made a few withdrawals for Dad's care. You know, Things that insurance doesn't cover. I've been paying for extra services at the nursing home. Better food, private duty nurses when he's having bad days. It was a reasonable explanation. If I hadn't seen the security footage, I might have believed it. That's really thoughtful of you, I said. Do you have receipts for those expenses? For our records? Derek's face flushed slightly. Some of them. The nurses prefer cash, you know. Easier for them to manage. Of course. Well, no problem. The bank should have copies of all the withdrawal slips with Dad's signature. We can reconcile everything against the care expenses. I stood up to leave, then turned back. Oh, Derek, one more thing. The bank's security department is reviewing all the footage from Dad's account activity. Just routine procedure when there are multiple large transactions. They'll probably want to interview both of us. Derek's face went completely white. Security footage? Standard practice, I said. They film everyone who makes withdrawals over a certain amount. Insurance requirements, you know? I walked away, leaving him sitting at that table, with his untouched coffee and the growing realization that his careful scheme was unraveling. 2 days later, Frank Morrison called. We've got him, he said simply. The footage is crystal clear and we found something else. Your brother's been using a practice pad to perfect your father's signature. One of our tellers found it in the trash can outside the bank after his last visit. A practice pad? Multiple sheets of paper with your father's name written dozens of times. Same pen. He used to sign the withdrawal slips. He literally threw away the evidence of his forgery practice. I closed my eyes. Derek had always been careless, but this was beyond careless. This was stupid. When will you arrest him? That's up to the federal prosecutor now. But Mr. Rodriguez, I've got 30 years in law enforcement and I've never seen a cleaner case of financial elder abuse. Your brother's going to prison. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in Dad's room at Sunset Manor when my phone rang. It was Derek's ex-wife, Maria. Michael, she said, her voice shaking. They arrested Derek at Tommy's graduation ceremony. Right there at the high school, in front of everyone, the FBI. They put him in handcuffs while my son was walking across the stage. Tommy was Derek's 16-year-old son, the one good thing to come out of his second marriage. A smart kid who'd never deserved to be embarrassed like that. I'm sorry, Maria, I said. And I meant it. I didn't know. They were planning to arrest him there. He says you set him up. Says you've been plotting against him for months. I looked at Dad, who was having one of his clearer days. He was watching me with those sharp eyes I remembered from childhood. Maria, Derek stole over $80,000 from Dad. While Dad has Alzheimer's, there was no setup, just evidence. She was quiet for a moment. Michael, I know Derek's got problems, but he's Tommy's father. What's going to happen to him? That's up to a judge and jury now. After she hung up, Dad reached over and took my hand. Michael, he said clearly, did I do the right thing? Teaching you boys about money, about responsibility? I squeezed his hand. Yes, Dad. You did everything right. Then why is Derek? He trailed off, confused again, the moment of clarity passing. Sometimes people make bad choices, Dad, even when they know better. The federal prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Chen, called me a week later to discuss Derek's case. We met at her office in downtown Phoenix, a sterile room with law books lining the walls and a view of the courthouse across the street. Mr. Rodriguez, she began, your brother's attorney has approached us about a plea deal. What kind of deal? He's willing to plead guilty to 1 count of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult in exchange for a recommendation of 2 years in federal prison and full restitution. I thought about Tommy's graduation, about the shame in Maria's voice, about Dad's confused questions about responsibility. What would happen if we went to trial? Based on the evidence? Multiple felony counts, probably 8 to 10 years in federal prison, plus restitution and fines. And the restitution? How does that work? Jennifer Chen consulted her notes. Your brother has assets. The house, the truck, various personal property. We can force liquidation to recover most of the stolen funds. The challenge is that he's already spent a significant portion of it. On what? Truck payments, home improvements, general living expenses. Classic pattern in these cases. The perpetrator treats the stolen money like it's their regular income. I asked the question I'd been dreading. How much can we realistically recover? Maybe 60%, 70% if we're lucky. I drove home that evening thinking about justice versus practicality. Derek would go to prison either way, but Dad would only get back a fraction of what was stolen. The money Derek had spent on trucks and televisions was gone forever. That night, I got a call from Derek himself. He was out on bail, living in his house until sentencing. Mike, he said, and his voice sounded different, smaller. Can we talk? There's nothing to talk about, Derek. Please, just give me 5 minutes. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him at a neutral location, the parking lot of a grocery store halfway between our neighborhoods. Derek was waiting when I arrived, leaning against his expensive truck. In the parking lot lights, he looked older, defeated. I know you hate me, he said as I approached. I don't hate you, Derek. I'm disappointed. Dad needed that money for his care. Dad has insurance and a pension. His care is paid for. Derek kicked at the asphalt. You don't understand what it's like, Mike. You've got your steady job, your government benefits. I've been struggling for years. So you decided to steal from Dad? I didn't think of it as stealing, he said quickly. I thought of it as an advance on my inheritance. I stared at him. Derek, Dad's not dead. He's not even close to dying. And you spent his money on toys for yourself. I was going to pay it back. With what money? You can barely afford your truck payments. Derek's shoulders sagged. I know it was wrong. But Mike, if I go to prison for 8 years, I'll lose everything. My son will hate me forever. Maria will never let me see him again. I felt a flicker of sympathy, then remembered the security footage of Derek laughing about Dad not remembering the thefts. You should have thought about that before you started forging signatures. The prosecutor says you could ask for a reduced sentence, family impact statement or something. If you told them I was under financial stress, that I made a mistake, but I'm not a career criminal. I looked at my brother, the man I'd protected and defended for most of our lives, and realized that even now, even after being caught red-handed, he was still trying to manipulate me. Derek, you spent 6 months systematically stealing from our father while he had Alzheimer's. You practiced his signature. You timed your visits to avoid me. You joked about him not remembering. That's not a mistake. That's a plan. So you won't help me? I'll help you in one way, I said. I'll make sure Dad gets back every penny you can possibly pay, and I'll make sure you never have access to his accounts again. Derek's face hardened. You always thought you were better than me. No, Derek, I just thought you were better than this. I walked back to my car, leaving him standing in that parking lot with his expensive truck and his empty explanations. 6 months later, Derek pleaded guilty to federal charges of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult and was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. The judge was not sympathetic to his financial circumstances, noting that he had violated the most fundamental trust between family members and shown a pattern of calculated deception. Through asset seizure and garnishment of his wages, we recovered $64,000 of the stolen funds. Not everything, but more than the prosecutor had initially projected. Derek's house was sold, his truck repossessed, and his personal belongings liquidated. Tommy came to live with Maria full-time, and she moved them both out of state to escape the shame. Dad never really understood what had happened. On his good days, he would ask about Derek, and I would tell him Derek was traveling for work. On his bad days, he didn't remember having a younger son at all. In a strange way, the Alzheimer's protected him from the worst pain of Derek's betrayal. I used the recovered money to set up a special care fund for Dad's future needs. Things insurance wouldn't cover, comfort items, private nursing, if his condition worsened. It felt appropriate somehow, using Derek's theft to ensure Dad's dignity in his final years. The FBI agent who worked the case, Special Agent Patricia Moss, told me later that elder financial abuse was one of the fastest-growing crimes in America, often perpetrated by family members who rationalized their theft as early inheritance or reimbursement for care. Your brother's case is textbook, she said. Family member with financial problems, elderly, victim with cognitive impairment, systematic withdrawals designed to avoid detection. The only unusual thing was how thoroughly he documented his own crimes. What do you mean? The practice signatures, the security footage, the audio recordings. Most criminals try to hide their actions. Your brother seemed almost proud of what he was doing. I thought about that conversation for weeks afterward. Derek had always been the type to take shortcuts, to assume he was smarter than everyone else. Even in committing crimes, he'd been arrogant enough to think he wouldn't get caught. 2 years into Derek's sentence, I received a letter from him. It was postmarked from the Federal Correctional Institution in Phoenix, written on thin prison stationery in his careful handwriting. Mike, it began, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I needed to tell you that I understand now what I did to Dad. There's an old man here, Charlie, who has dementia. His son was sending him money for commissary, and some of the other inmates were taking advantage of him. I saw how confused and scared he got when people lied to him, and I realized that's what I did to Dad. I'm not asking for forgiveness, and I'm not asking you to visit me. I just wanted you to know that I get it now. I stole from someone who trusted me completely. Someone who couldn't defend himself. I've written letters to Dad, even though I know he probably won't understand them. Maybe you could read one to him sometime if you think it wouldn't upset him. I heard Tommy graduated high school with honors. Maria sent pictures. Tell him I'm proud of him if you ever see him. And Mike, take care of Dad. You're the only one he has left who won't take advantage of him. I read the letter twice, then filed it away with the rest of the case documents. Derek's remorse might have been genuine, but it didn't change what he'd done or bring back the money he'd spent on luxuries while Dad lived in a nursing home. 3 years later, on a Tuesday afternoon in spring, I was sitting in Dad's room at Sunset Manor when he had one of his increasingly rare moments of clarity. He looked at me with recognition and said, "Michael, what happened to Derek? He used to visit, but I haven't seen him in a long time." I took his hand and chose my words carefully. "Derek made some bad choices, Dad. He's away learning how to make better ones." Dad nodded slowly. "Did I fail him? Somehow? As a father?" "No, Dad. You taught us both about right and wrong. Derek chose wrong, but that wasn't your fault. You chose right, though," he said with a faint smile. "You always were my responsible son." He squeezed my hand once, then closed his eyes and drifted back into the fog of his disease. But for those few minutes, he had been himself again, the man who'd taught me about integrity, about protecting family, about the difference between right and wrong. Derek was released from federal prison after serving 2.5 years. He moved to a halfway house in Tucson and found work as a day laborer for a construction company that hired ex-felons. Maria allowed him supervised visits with Tommy, who was now in college studying accounting, a career choice that I couldn't help but find ironically appropriate. Derek and I never reconciled. We exchanged a few brief emails about Dad's care, but the trust was gone forever. Some betrayals cut too deep to heal, especially when they involve the most vulnerable members of your family. Dad passed away 4 years after Derek's arrest, on a quiet morning in late summer. His final years had been comfortable and dignified, thanks in part to the money we'd recovered from Derek's theft. In his lucid moments, he never knew that his younger son had betrayed him, and I considered that a mercy. At Dad's funeral, Derek appeared in the back of the church wearing an ill-fitting suit and sunglasses. He didn't approach the family section, didn't try to speak to me or anyone else. He just sat quietly through the service, then disappeared before the burial. Later, I found a handwritten note tucked under my car's windshield wiper. "Thank you for taking care of him. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I hope someday you can understand that losing Dad's trust was a worse punishment than prison. Derek." I crumpled up the note and threw it away. Understanding and forgiveness are two different things, and while I could understand Derek's regret, I couldn't forget his choice to steal from a helpless old man who loved him unconditionally. As I drove home from the cemetery, I thought about the lessons Dad had tried to teach us both, that family takes care of family, that honor matters more than money, that trust once broken is nearly impossible to repair. Derek had learned those lessons too late, and the cost had been everything he'd claimed to value, the recovered. Money had paid for Dad's final care, ensuring he spent his last years with dignity instead of in some underfunded state facility. In the end, that money had served its intended purpose, protecting a vulnerable man from those who would exploit him, even if one of those people had been his own son. Sometimes justice isn't about revenge or punishment. Sometimes it's simply about making sure the right people are protected, and the wrong choices have consequences. Derek had made his choice, when he decided Dad wouldn't remember anyway. The bank cameras, the FBI, and the federal prison system had ensured he was wrong about that. Dad remembered everything that mattered, right up until the end.